Broadcasting from the United States of America, this is WRMI, Okeechobee, Florida, Radio Miami International.
Please send music requests or reception reports to weloveshortwave@gmail.com. Again, weloveshortwave@gmail.com.
You're listening to Quorum Radio.
Tonight, folks, on Quorum Radio, we're going to be hearing from author Kenneth Womack, Beatles historian and researcher, concerning his book, Maximum Volume, about the life of Beatles producer George Martin. Next, folks, after the music, stay tuned, and you're listening to Global Shortwave Radio, WRMI.
Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. Someone to love, somebody new. Someone to love, someone like you. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. Yeah, love me do. Oh, love me do.
Folks, as you know, in Quorum Radio, we have lots and lots of eclectic pursuits and interests, one of which is the Beatles. And I'm on today with somebody who's the world's leading authorities on the Beatles. That is Kenneth Womack. He's the author of a 2-volume biography devoted to famed Beatles producer, the man behind the music, Sir George Martin, including Maximum Volume and Sound Pictures. His latest book is Living the Beatles Legend, the untold story of Mel Evans, who was the incredible roadie of the Beatles. Ken Womack's Beatles-related books also include Long and Winding Roads, The Evolving Artistry of the Beatles, The Cambridge Companion to the Beatles Encyclopedia, Everything Fab Four, Solid State, The Story of Abbey Road, and The End of the Beatles, and John Lennon's 1980, The Last Days in the Life. Ken is also the author of 5 novels, including John Doe 2 and The Dreamland Motel, The Restaurant at the End of the World, Playing the Angel, and I Am Lemonade Lucy, and The Time Diaries. Ken is also has a day job as a professor of English and popular music at Monmouth University in the Garden State, right?
That's right here at the home of the new Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music.
Okay, well, that's an interesting spot. So he's the founding editor of Interdisciplinary Literary Studies, a journal of criticism and theory, published by Penn State University Press, and co-editor of the English Association's prodigious Year's Work in English Studies, published by Oxford University Press. He's also served as an expert commentator for the BBC, NPR, ABC's 2020, MSNBC's Morning Joe, Fox Business America's American Built, and NBC's Access Hollywood. And in addition to this man is they call him polymaths nowadays. He's been studying Russian language quite some time and literature at the Moscow Institute of Communication. Ken earned his BA and his master's degree in English from Texas A&M University and a PhD in English from Northern Illinois University. Folks, check out his website. Get a pencil, www.kennethwomack.com. That's Kenneth Womack, spelled WOMACK.com, KennethWomack.com. And since you're in Eminence, Greece, what I do with Eminence, Greece, I don't know if you know this, but this is one of the crazy things about Forum Radio is that we introduce distinguished guests with a poem, a limerick, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Good. Searching for gems, this man, he doth choose it, particularly regarding the best of Liverpool music. On this pursuit, he doesn't merely tipple, but takes hearty draughts of Beatles music and Quarryman's skiffle. His encyclopedic knowledge of all things Fab Four is not a mere trifle, but enough to make a foul expert poseur a little bit frightful. From this fellow's life today will barely glimpse a crack. The man to whom I refer, Jersey's Ken Womack. Anyway, it's and my psychiatrist gives this to me as therapy.
Well, I mean, you seem very balanced, so it must be working.
Yeah, man. Thank you. So anyway, let me just dive into this. It's fascinating. So that George Martin is the guy that oftentimes called the fifth Beatle. I think with a lot of justification. But give us an idea of the breadth of his work, George Martin's career and accomplishments. Was it just the Beatles, or were there other great music artists too that he helped produce?
You know, Brian Epstein would give him credit for producing lots of bands and having the magic touch. But George would quickly point out that he did with one band, the Beatles. He would have success with other bands, you know, in the late period of America in the 1970s and several others. And certainly the beat bands that came out of Liverpool. But there was nothing that was like his relationship and collaboration with the Beatles. That was the marriage that was made in heaven.
Right. And so tell us about his initial work at he was with EMI Records, or a division of EMI called Parlophone. Tell us about his initial work from 1950 to 1962 before he signed the Beatles at Parlophone, which is, like I said, a division of EMI Records. How did it prepare him for the Beatles?
You know, George Martin is a miracle of the post-war boom. He is just an absolute miracle of it. He shouldn't have happened. But thanks to various programs during World War II, he was connected with people that he normally would never have met, including a guy named Sidney Harrison, who was at the Guildhall School for Music. And it was Sidney who lifted the very, very lower class George Martin up into the Guildhall School. And George went there in the late 40s. And in 1950, a job opened up at EMI working with a fellow named Oscar Preuss. And it was Sidney Harrison again who said, you should go to this interview. And George, who was practically penniless at the time, wore his navy gray coat and rode his bicycle to St. John's Wood and took the only job he was offered, which was to be the assistant producer or A&R head, assistant A&R head to Mr. Preuss. And the first thing Preuss told him was, they're trying to close down our label. And so for the next 12 years, George would spend his time trying to keep his job afloat and not let them close down the label. That was the whole game. And when Preuss retired in 55, everybody was all but sure that it was just a matter of time until they closed the doors on Parlophone. But George surprised everybody by working with comedy acts. He started with Peter Ustinov, and then he moved to Dudley Moore, and then eventually guys who were in the Goons, especially Peter Sellers, and they scored a number of hit comedy records, and suddenly Parlophone became this kind of magical label where anybody who couldn't find a home anywhere else could be successful.
Right. So it's really extraordinary. And his background, as far as like his professional development, he was at the Guildhall Music Conservatory, was it called? Or
That's right.
Institute?
Guildhall. The Guildhall is on the south side of the Thames. And it was a pretty prestigious school. I mean, George would never have gotten anywhere near it if it weren't for Sidney Harrison. He called Sidney Harrison my fairy godfather.
Oh, wow. How about
And
that?
yeah, but
Amazing.
Sidney was, Sidney was wonderful. There was this program during World War II where fellows of various stations, like Sidney, would write to people with similar interests who were off on the front, right? And George Martin was interested in piano, and Sidney would send notation back and forth to George, and that's really how their friendship began.
Wow. So he's dealing with people like Peter Ustinov, Peter Sellers. There's a few other fellows that because I'm on. I have about 3 hours left of your book, your audiobook. Uh, and so and also Sophia Loren, didn't she also like
Yeah,
pass
he
through
worked
Parlophone
with
Studios at that time?
yeah, there was a hit single that Sophia and Peter Sellers recorded. It's one of these now that it is very un-PC, where Peter Sellers will do his Indian voice. And I think it's Goodness Gracious Me. Yeah, and but George, George is a working producer. He produced Matt Monroe, who was a crooner, who was a hit in England. They did From Russia with Love, and then right around before the Beatles and around contemporaneously with them, he was still working with Shirley Bassey. They did Goldfinger, so there were a number of acts that were working with Parlophone. But of course, the Beatles would eclipse everything when they showed up. I don't think we'd even know about
Right.
Parlophone if it weren't for them. And it's interesting to think that we might not have the Beatles, certainly not in the way we do, if not for Sidney Harrison.
He's an unsung hero.
He really is
For
because,
it's a
um, I have
mentors,
people after
right?
I give talks on the road, people will try to tell me, well, the Beatles would have been great without George Martin. And I think that's probably bunk.
Oh
Nobody else
yes,
would have,
sure.
yeah, nobody else would have tended to them in the kind of fatherly way he did.
Right. And then, by the way, during that 12-year period before the Beatles were signed by Parlophone, he was developing just like using a lot of experimentation, right, with sound.
That's right.
And he loved that. He loved that.
He did, in the Christmas of 1958, like a lot of folks, he was mesmerized by the Chipmunk song. Um, and
Oh yeah.
it affected everybody. The idea that you could manipulate sound and speed up tape and slow it down. I mean, even Buddy Holly in his last recordings in his apartment was after he heard that song was trying out different speeds. It was quite revelatory and revolutionary. And so, of course, we know that George Martin picks up on that and suddenly starts manipulating tape speed with instruments and voices. And of course, it's a natural fit for comedy.
Of course. So, but by the way, one of the things, I mean, just for people who don't know who the Chipmunks were, that was basically that was a song. I don't know, a musical production company came up with this idea that you could, I can get humans singing Christmas carols and things like that, and speeding it up in such a way that they sounded like they were, different creatures. So interesting. So
Oh, it
let's go
was.
you know, no, go ahead. Sorry.
I had nothing else.
So I was okay, good. All right, good. Well, what I wanted to ask you is, tell us about George Martin first encountering the Beatles and how he decided to bet on them and what was involved in that encounter. I think Brian Epstein was kind of shopping around to find a record label, right, for the Fab Four. He thought they were incredible. I think he had gone to the Cavern Club and he heard them, and it was just like kind of an electric, vibe between the audience and the Beatles in Liverpool. So how did how did Brian Epstein, the Beatles, and Parlophone and George Martin meet?
Sure. So, yeah, as you said, Brian heard them in November 1961. He was blown away. He moved very quickly. He suddenly, the light went off and he thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to manage this band. And very quickly, he had that New Year's Day, rather, 1962 audition with Decca, and they were all crestfallen when they didn't get that contract. They thought that was a layup, and it just didn't happen. And they were, like I said, they were very crestfallen. And Brian had to go out immediately and went back to several people who'd rejected him. He had already been rejected, the Beatles had, by EMI. But he had been sent there by Sid Coleman, who was at Ardmore and Beechwood. And Sid said, you should try this with George Martin. And George Martin, you have to remember his psychology. In his mind, it didn't make any sense to work with an act from up in the sticks in Liverpool. He'd spent his whole life trying to get away from the sticks. And here suddenly they're being thrust at him. And then Brian didn't do himself any favors when he said they would be bigger than Elvis. For George Martin, that sounded ridiculous. And anybody would have thought that was ridiculous in 1962. It just happens on this moment it was true, right? And in any event, he had to, George Martin, even though things didn't go that well in the conversation, he did say, you can bring them down to London and we'll have a session. But Brian didn't want to do that without a sure thing. He wanted a contract in hand. And it would be a few months before some EMI executives, Capital was a subsidiary of EMI, a few months before George Martin's boss said, why didn't you sign that guy's band from Liverpool? And it made sense why they would. Brian ran the biggest record retailer in the North. A contract in those days was worth nothing. EMI owned well, not anymore, but owned Abbey Road Studios outright. So their sunk costs were all but zero. It was really just a matter of using time in a studio they owned. So George Martin said, fine, it's your money. If you want me to sign them, I will. And Brian was summoned down to London in May 1962. And he came in to the business offices, not at Abbey Road, but downtown in Manchester Square. And there was a contract laid out on the table. And Brian did what you do when somebody gives you a gift horse like that. He just started signing. Because a miracle had happened. And of course, within the month, they were at Abbey Road. And George really didn't know what to do with him. He didn't know who the leader was. They seemed scruffy to him. That first session, there were a number of problems with every one of the players, especially Pete Best had a terrible day. But everybody was not doing so well. And afterwards, of course, George would famously sit with them in the control room and give them pointers on all the things they were doing wrong. And that's when George Harrison probably saved their career, because George said, is there anything you don't like about what I'm doing? And Harrison looked at Martin and said, well, I don't like your tie. And it could have gone so badly. This is a guy they just met. And he's this stern, tall, seemingly educated former Navy man. And George looked at them for a minute and then just burst out laughing. And he said afterwards he had tears running down his cheeks, that it was so hilarious. And they broke into one of their routines. And I have a darling little video that Giles Martin put out. Giles, George's youngest son, put out a few years ago of George during the last, I guess, years of his life, and he's explaining the band to his granddaughter. And he says in the video, I thought, well, I like them so much, I just figure other people will too. And that was the one hunch he had.
Amazing. And by the way, just for art,
no worries.
Pardon me. I'll edit this out. So the initial approach was to a different subsidiary of EMI, not Parlophone, but something Armand and Beechwood. What was the name of it? So
the Ardmore and Beechwood were EMI's publishing arm. So they had their own publishing firm inside EMI. And they naturally, when they liked some of the recordings Brian was playing for them, Sid Coleman and his assistant Kim Bennett, they said, well, go see George Martin, because naturally they wanted to keep the publishing and the music in-house. It was a smart
Right,
move.
right,
Now, George Martin is a lovely man, but he can be very naughty. And
right.
he was a little pissed off with EMI later on. And so when it came time to circle back around and ensure EMI got the publishing, he went outside the company to Dick James.
Oh,
So,
wow.
and
Interesting.
there'd
So
be a
yeah,
few moments like this. George could be passive aggressive.
yeah, well, I think he dealt with some stodgy, like downright systemically stupid, stodgy establishment types in EMI's executive offices. And what before I get to that, so he has the first I mean, by the way, when he went to that other subsidiary, didn't they do a demo recording there because they could
Well,
get something to talk?
so Brian already had the demos. After the Decca sessions failed, Brian was given the recordings. And so what
That's
Brian was
tapes.
there to do that day, I guess in February 1962, it was above the old, on Oxford Street, above the old HMV. Brian, I keep saying their names together. They are not the same guy. Brian went there to have some lacquers made of those recordings so
Right.
that he could then carry them around to meet with various producers and the like, who always had a phonograph right there in their
Yeah, so
office.
it's basically like a special, like an original disc,
Right,
band,
acetates. And
right, a record.
and so that's how the Sid and Kim were able to hear those songs. They thought they really liked it was I guess it was Kim Bennett who really liked like Dreamers Do,
Yeah.
which was one of the songs that he wanted for EMI. The irony is the Beatles would never record it again or play it again. They played it on January
Wow.
1st night. Yeah, I
That's
think it's a lovely little tune myself.
right. Well, their first live demo in front of George Martin. Tell us about that. That was like borderline catastrophic, right?
Well, they did 4 songs, and I leave it in the hands of the wonderful Ken Townsend, who started at EMI the same week that George Martin did. And Ken would be the one who would be the brainchild behind naming the studio Abbey Road. And to connote it with the Beatles, he would be the one who would save the studio in the 70s and 80s by moving into soundtracks and then opening it up to non-EMI artists. And thankfully, Ken is still with us. He's 93. And Ken said it almost ended immediately. I asked him once what was his first time he heard the Beatles. He said, well, the first thing he heard was a giant farting sound. And I said, what? He said, I heard a giant farting sound. I was in the studio next door and I heard Paul's bass amp die. And so the session almost failed before it started. And what happened was our pal Ken Townsend went in and rigged something up so that they could do the session, or they would have had to end it. The Beatles didn't have
Right.
backup equipment or anything like that,
And
and
then
their
they also,
equipment was pretty beat up. They played 4 songs that day. Let's see, "Ask Me Why," "Besame Mucho," and of course the one that gets all the discussion is "Love Me Do," which was a fairly new and original song. And poor Pete Best, uh, anybody can hear it for themselves. It's on Anthology 1, and it just is. It's a pretty rough recording. He lags, he speeds up, and consequently, George Martin noticed this and said, I don't mind if you use that guy on stage, but let's have somebody else. Let's have somebody else when they come in to record.
right. So then, and by the way, I think wasn't it like John Lennon's speaker was so bad that it had horrible sound, right?
No, that was Paul's bass amp dying. I mean, everybody had something wrong that day.
But then didn't you find out that they had a rep like rope around one of the amplifiers because it was vibrating so much.
Um, okay, perhaps.
Yeah, no, it's okay. No, it's all right. Don't worry. I remember that stood out. And then the Pete Best playing was horrible. Uh, and then of course, as you mentioned, he called George Martin calls him in and gives him some tough love.
That's
Wow,
right. He
amazing.
did.
So I mean, by the way, it looks to me like Brian Epstein's the fact that he owned this, his family owned this big record store that just you know pumped out huge amounts of records in Liverpool. I guess was a huge factor that made them more attractive because this is somebody we won't lose too much on it. We can keep these people happy. I mean, how when they signed that contract that was lying on the table, what did it stipulate as far as compensation and rights and all that?
I mean, they call them penny per record contracts. And, it's part of the long history of new acts being signed for a pittance. Everybody's desperate then and now to have a contract, right? And if the Beatles had had a number one record and nobody thought they'd have a number one anything, right?
Yeah.
They would split 500 pounds roughly between John, Paul, George, Pete, and Brian. So
Okay.
that,
Each one 20%.
it was not going to be a bonanza if they were successful. But of course, this was the needle in the haystack, and the Beatles would be the band that would be so mega successful that almost immediately they would renegotiate that deal. And EMI begrudgingly did so. They were, as you said, they were pretty stodgy. They got a little mad at George Martin for the renegotiation, but George Martin was shrewd. Why would you let them go? They had 6 sides. That's all they were obligated for with EMI. They might have
Right.
easily gone packing after 3 singles.
Right. And those three singles, how did they do? How well were they received?
Well, the first one was number 17. That was Love Me Do. But then after that, they went on what George Martin called the roll, and everything was number one until Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, which was the anomaly. And then they picked up the roll again in England and were number one through the rest of their career. Actually, I think Let It Be breaks it in UK. But
Well, s-
yeah,
I
so it
was
was
going to
very
say
short-sighted.
17 should be kind of number 17 for the debut single. That's pretty respectable.
It's very respectable. And because of that, George Martin would tell the Beatles that they could then record a full album. But what really gave George Martin confidence was the whole kerfuffle over Please Please Me, the song. Um, the Beatles came in playing it very slowly. George Martin just flat out did not like it when he heard it. And he said something ridiculous to them. He said, well, why didn't you rehearse it at a faster tempo? And of course, they looked at each other like, well, we made it up this way. What are you talking about? This is the song. But what they did was instead of, being nasty about George Martin and that request, they went home for the entire week and rehearsed it. And they came back and the thing was fast. And George Martin was impressed that they'd listened to him and done exactly what he said. Really, at that moment, they were his band because he
But
realized they could take
go ahead.
criticism and they could come back and do something.
But they were workable. They could be molded. They could be coached, right? And this is a really important, I think, factor in their favor. But it also gets back to George Martin, the type of man he was. What were his traits, and how did they play into the successful chemistry and project of making the Beatles a superstar group?
Well, he looked at them, he used to call them hothouse flowers, that they were always growing and changing, and that his job was not to make them what he wanted them to be, but make them into what they should be, which is a really crucial distinction that we all would do well to remember, right? We would all do well to remember that. And so he was just a great politician with them. He would sort of parry and thrust. He knew when to pull back and sort of let them kind of fight it out for themselves. He was very good at seeing where the hot hand was, and of course, more often than not, it was Lennon and McCartney in some form or another. One of his few misreads is he probably took a little longer than he should have to realize just how amazing George Harrison was going to be. He sort of treated him like the junior member of the band, and later apologized to him for that too, by the way. But he kind of misread that just a little bit. But he was a very good politician, and he didn't come at them like other producers might have, which is you bring in the songs, we have 90 minutes to record them, let's see what happens, and then you go home. George Martin kept stoking them to find new sounds, to take each track as far as it would go. All of these very, very smart moves that he would make made such a difference in that band. He was the right kind of nurturing personality for them. And he had an axe to grind, which always helps too. He didn't like being the number 3 label at EMI, and he didn't like being behind a guy named Norrie Paramore, who produced Cliff Richard. And in George's mind, he was always an underdog. So every Beatles success was his success, and he was showing the man, right? And to him, that was very important.
Oh, so because he had been basically this guy, the guy you just mentioned, was basically doing all sorts of skullduggery. He was like coming up with like fake names of musicians, and then it was to be able to receive the royalties, from them, and all the stuff that was basically under the radar. And then so George Martin told David Frost about it, right?
Yeah, George, that's what I meant about George.
He got him in trouble.
Little bit of a passive aggressive side. Norrie was not a mean man at all. He was a nice guy. He was a lovely older fellow. He's older than George at the time. And Norrie what had to do those B-sides using anonymous names because he wasn't allowed to earn any additional money with EMI, which was one of George Martin's issues with them. Is that they wouldn't allow him.
They were brothers. They were brothers in against the same overlords who were like squeezing them. And so tell us about and this is the thing about George Martin's personality traits. He was 1963 was the first big year for the Beatles. Is that pretty much the case? How many hits did they have in 1963?
They were George Martin's bands that year were number 1 37 out of the 52 weeks on both the album and singles charts. I mean, they absolutely dominated.
It was a huge year, man.
It was absolutely a year. It was a year that changed EMI's fortunes. Before that, the number 1 record company in the world was Decca, and then EMI took over, and for a good long time, never looked back.
And so that year, I'm just wondering, in 1963, how many records did the Beatles sell under the EMI Parlophone label? Like several million, right?
Oh, yeah. And they made something like a profit of £9 million, which was unbelievable in that day and age. And they're doing it on the backs of a really terrible contract, Now, they're making money hands over fist, and the Beatles are okay today, but EMI was making out like bandits on that. And incredibly, George Martin had to shame them. He had to shame them into renegotiating that contract and giving them a bump. And then, of course, they didn't give George Martin a bonus after 1963, even though his secretary got one. It was a piddly like $250 or something, and he was rightly furious.
Well, I guess just to bring up, the inflationary conversion, that was equivalent to about £9 million. My gosh, man, that was like about $22 million, and in today's money, that's like 200 million. It's unbelievable.
Right. To imagine your label going from, you know,
Being moribund at death's door.
right, and then suddenly you're king of the roost. I mean, it was incredible. Just
So
incredible. And in this day and age, our not that our companies are any better and they don't exploit people, but um I like to think that there would have been an attempt to negotiate just a little bit better to make it happen. And your first worry is to make sure you keep them inside your stable. They were doing everything they could to screw it up. They didn't even try it. So George Martin will leave in 1965, as you know,
right.
and go out on his own. They didn't even try to offer him a real counteroffer to stay until 1969. And by then he'd figured out that he didn't need them to make money.
Oh, you know something? This just astonishes me. He will tell us about his compensation package in 1963.
I believe it was 3,000 pounds a year, which, is not terrible in 1963. It's not terrible, but it had no room for growth and it had no ability to inspire innovation and any kind of move toward greatness.
And reward productivity, reward hits.
Yeah, that's right. It was asinine is what it was. And, but that was the mentality of companies at that time. They may not be any better now. They may be worse in other ways, but I like to think that somebody would have said, you know,
Let's
let,
wake up, man.
yeah, let's wake up and let's make sure that this guy doesn't leave and go somewhere else.
Just astonishing to me because I did a conversion of the money. 3,000 pounds, like 8,000 US at that time was like $2. 2 pounds, 1 pound was $2.80 in the early 60s. So that came out to about 8,000 US, which is in today's money is like $91,000, which for a guy who basically took EMI to the forefront to be, a King Kong in the British recording industry was so enormous that a guy like that today, I mean, you would think that they'd pay him $500,000 a year, $1 million a year, or something like that, and with incredible bonuses. But and so they were just, I mean, was it snobbery? What was the problem with the EMI management? Why were they so slow and so
Well,
I
I
don't
mean,
know,
look, they were top
disdainful?
down. They would figure it out though. It took a long, long time though for the word to get up to their esteemed chairman of the board, a guy named Joseph Lockwood, Sir Joseph Lockwood. The Beatles called him Sir Joe. And Lockwood got it and was able to speak the Beatles language, and he learned how to converse with them and to find ways to show his thankfulness. He was a different sort and was successful at it. But prior to that, they really were bent on just destroying their relationship with them. But Sir Joe really stepped up and realized what they had. But it took a long time to get to that point. There was a kind of austerity. Part of it is it was the post-war world. We all should be just happy that we're not dead, right? And you
You got
know,
your ration today, you got your tea and scone, so shut up.
yeah, right. I mean, when George Martin signed that contract, they were still rationing.
Oh, unbelievable. Oh yeah. Wow. So we go to you look at Parlophone before and after George Martin. Give us an idea. You've already suggested how amazing this guy was with the Beatles. How was it? What happened? What was Parlophone before and after George Martin?
Well, afterwards, they were the fruit of George Martin's toil. They were this amazing label that would succeed on the back of the Beatles over and over and over again. And they would have some latter day successes. Coldplay was with Parlophone. So there were a number of real successes. The company was obviously richer and the better for George Martin having been with them. But
And
they
it
moved
became
in,
it became huge,
sure, but
huge.
then you move into the mid 60s and George Martin is kind of at the vanguard of a new boon where producers are like directors or auteurs, right?
Yeah.
Who are seen as kind of the shapers and makers of sound and image. And, there was a new era afoot that Parlophone wasn't necessarily equipped to handle.
Right. Wow. So then we've got, he in 1964 he gives notice that he's going to resign. Unbelievable. They just thought that this guy was, the Beatles, they're a flash in the pan. Nobody will remember them. So he gives notice to them in a letter, but he starts this thing called Air, right? And which was, I think that what it stand for was
Associated Independent Recording.
Associated Independent Recording. But right, he ends up still producing the Beatles. How'd that happen? I mean, they just decide to, okay, George is disgruntled. He's a pretty competent guy, so continue to work with him, right? But what happened? How did EMI continue this relationship?
Well, they had to sit down and figure out, okay, what will our deal be? What will our means of moving forward be? Because they certainly knew enough not to want to upset the apple cart of the Beatles and risk losing them. And upsetting George would have been probably a death spiral for them because the Beatles would have sided with Martin, I think, undoubtedly at that point. This was
I mean,
prior.
they love the guy, right?
Sure, and this was prior to Rubber Soul, so yeah, absolutely, they would have stayed with him. So um, they just negotiated sort of an exit agreement, but it was a terrible agreement. And it was terribly against George Martin, but he didn't care at this point. He was so disgusted. And it just fed his ire and his desire to get back at them via success. And of course, that's what he's going to do the rest of the 1960s and beyond. The Beatles will be the biggest thing that ever happened to all of them. And there are always casualties, right? When you have paradigm shifts. I remind my students of this all the time, that when you have these moments where key instances occur and folks realize that a lot is changing, that there's just as many people who don't want things to change at all and are often casualties of these experiences. I mean, for every Steve Jobs and Wozniak, and Bill Gates, there were lots of people saying, no, computers are always going to take up at the size of a bedroom,
Right.
And
Sure.
so and there are winners and losers with paradigm shifts. One of the great losers is Capitol Records' Davy Dexter Jr., who kept refusing to put out the Beatles in the United States all throughout 1963. He said their sound won't sell. Well, nothing's ever sold like the Beatles in the United States. He was completely wrong. And
Right.
he would suffer for it. But that's what happens. There are
Yeah, they
people
also
who misread the paradigm shift. And so what I like to challenge my students to do is think about these kind of things. What are the paradigm shifts that are happening right now around us? Where we might very much want it to be like it used to be because it was easier for us. It was easier for us to
right,
predict.
predictable.
Yeah, and we make a lot of really bad decisions on that.
Well,
You
so
know,
sure, but George did something interesting. He found this little label of these black entrepreneurs in Gary, Indiana. I think they were called the VJ Records, and he ended up like funneling the rights for songs that Capitol refused to record and or to distribute, and he gave rights to them. Tell us about that.
right. So Capitol had the right of first refusal, and that was Davy Dexter refusing to release them. He had the right of first refusal. But after that refusal, Brian and George then had to, on behalf of their client, they had a duty to see if they could find other means for their records to be released, and they could license them for a fixed period to other labels. And so there would be VJ and Swan and Tolly. All of these little record labels would get Beatles songs all throughout 1963. And one of the bigger screw ups by Davy Dexter Jr. was not releasing the records via Capitol and allowing that to happen. Because then, fast forward to February 1964, the Beatles are on the Sullivan Show. They're suddenly having this bonanza moment in terms of sales across the United States. And when fans would go to the store to buy records, there wouldn't just be Capitol records in the record stores. There would be records by VJ and Tolly and Swan. And so some of these records suddenly were charting and taking up revenue that should have been Capitol's. So, not Dave screwed up. Dave Dexter screwed up coming and going. He screwed up by not wanting to take the chance. And he screwed up on the other side by the time that Beatlemania rolls around, a lot of the money is not going to Capitol.
Amazing. And so the VJ has an album called Introducing the Beatles, right? And it's like charting like in the top 5 albums, right?
That's right. And it actually had, because of its life of its licensure, it actually existed for a little bit of time out there, making money for them. They probably would have made much more. They were pretty poorly run. VJ's owner had a good stake of money that they could have used to promote things earlier in the year, but he blew it all in Vegas. Now, the truth is that.
But Abner something, I remember the guy's name, and
the truth is, it's easy to pick on Dave Dexter, but as history knows, the Beatles story really happens in 1964, and it happens on the back of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which the Beatles, intentionally crafted with the sound of surf rock, etc. So it's hard to lay everything at the feet of Dave Dexter, but it is a great lesson in class for me to remind
and humility, or the lack of humility.
The lack, or just the fact that the thing about paradigm shifts is, right? You got to be ready to be wrong, and not just a little wrong, but mega wrong.
Right. And be agile in recognizing it and quickly capitalizing on the obvious trend, man. They love the Beatles. So I think par excellence, one could say that George Martin was the 5th Beatle. How many songs did he play on? He played the piano and stuff, right?
Well, he was their first studio musician for quite a long time. He and Mal Evans probably were on the most records. I think they reached
Mal
on
Evans play? Wait, did Mal Evans
No,
play?
he really didn't play, but they would have him on the records. They were on
as like a favor, as a royalty.
Well, they need somebody to do something, and they'd be like, "Mal, put your finger on this key. Mal, come in and play the tambourine. Play the bass drum on Yellow Submarine." And Mal would do it.
Oh wow! Huh? So, but right. So then he was also one of the Beatles as well, sort of. So but George played on like 20 or 30 hits, right? The piano and.
George was a great scratch player. He could read notation, so when they did rock and roll music, he just sat down and imitated Jerry Lee Lewis, and they got it in, may have even been one take. It was just like that because they could do it. He was that good. He would play on several songs over the years. He played the piano on Good Night for Ringo. He played on Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, but just song after song because he was there and he could do it.
Listen, we've gone more than 45 minutes. Can I ask you a couple more questions, please?
You bet.
Great. Listen, so Northern songs, man. Tell us about Northern songs. What this like it was a mechanism to somehow that I don't know if it's Brian and Brian Epstein and George Martin created with this guy Dick James.
It was
And
with
tell
Dick.
us about
Yeah.
that, how it turned out just like becoming, you know, a wreck of a contract.
It probably shouldn't have been. Dick James did, boy, he gave himself a healthy fee for
I'm sorry, how what?
a healthy fee for supervising, that publishing. Um, and that probably didn't help. That exploitation of the artist is has such a long and sad history in this and many other industries. And Dick James probably was giving himself too high a fee. But the way it all falls apart is when they got the opportunity to buy shares themselves. Lennon and McCartney were just not on the same page by then in 1968, 69, and really, really screwed it up pretty royally, as much as anybody else did. They had a chance to shore things up. They were cash poor at that point because of Apple, and that didn't help. Or they might have gotten the rights back at that point. Instead, we get many years later to the fracas with Michael Jackson, who essentially takes over, what Dick James was doing, which is taking a fee for the publishing. Remember, so much is made about that, but really when Michael purchased Sony ATV in 83, I think it was, really what he was purchasing was the right to manage the music. He wasn't getting all of the money. The Beatles were still what he was getting was an agent's fee, right? For
Yeah.
handling the music. So it's not quite the debacle that people say it is, other than as Mr. McCartney well knows, he should have gotten the deal and closed it. That's all on him, not on Michael. Paul was being and has been known for being notoriously cheap, and may have also felt like I shouldn't have to pay for my music. But whatever the case was, it would be several more decades in this century until Paul got all that back.
Right, right. So then, and if you look at the George Martin after after the Beatles and all that, he at some point he signed Elton John. He had Cilla Black, of course, that was during the time of the Beatles. Shirley Bassey. He had some amazing groups that he was involved with, and of course the his role as a movie soundtrack producer was quite formidable. You know,
Yeah, although he, you know, will forever be associated with the awfulness of what is it? Of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1978. That was his too.
Bad Too
But
Badly.
he would have many successes. Jeff Beck was one of his favorite recordings. The album Diamond Dogs, I believe. Diamonds and
Yeah.
what was it called? Diamond Dogs is David Bowie. Sorry, folks.
That's
Uh,
okay. Uh, no,
Diamond
that's fine. That's fine.
Diamond Dust.
Right.
He would work with Jeff Beck and really make one of his best albums, maybe the one for which Jeff is known.
Sure. So now after he left EMI, the guy knew how to make money. He was so gifted. He had sort of the golden touch. How much was he worth at towards the end of his life? And based on what you've been able to
I'm sure it was
ascertain.
tens of millions of pounds. He would, he was an innovator, so he'd like to innovate. And he, of course, would build the incredible studio down in Montserrat in the Caribbean that would be destroyed. Um,
Oh my, yeah, because of the earthquake, right? Or the volcano.
both. I mean, it had,
The
and I
eruption.
think even a hurricane came along later in case they didn't to finish the job. um, But yeah, he,
Oh
you
my
know,
God.
that was a terrible situation. Just a terrible, terrible situation. But, literally billions of worth of albums were made down in that studio during the 1980s. It was just the place to be.
Well, sure. So we look at, his personal life. He was married to Sheena Chisholm, who was also a student of music and she's kind of a retiring, shy type of personality. He had a couple of children with her, um, Alexis Martin and Gregory Paul Martin, and then he ended up having getting involved with in a relationship, extramarital relationship with the receptionist Judy Lockhart Smith.
It was almost it's almost a kind of a cliche, right?
Yeah. So and then, but yes, exactly. And then you see what happens. The second wife. I mean, the first wife passes away. He divorces her. She passes away. It's pretty tragic. And
They
then
get divorced in 1966. She really did not want to divorce him, and
who loved them, right?
yeah, she did love him, and they had the two kids together, wonderful kids, and I think that had a lot to do with it. I think George exaggerated her shyness. People do that, right? Unfortunately, we know that when they're trying to come up with reasons why they should divorce someone, they will often say, well, she was this, he was that, etc. And I think he did a little bit of that, to be fair to her. But he was in love with Judy Lockhart Smith, and let's face it, George was upwardly mobile. You know, that was his whole raison d'etre, and she
And
was a
and that was his second wife,
right, and they will be together.
upper crust lady, whose father was
Right.
until until he
Yeah,
passed
Kenneth
away in
Lockhart Smith was
2016.
in the film industry.
Right. But that was Judy's father, right?
Yes, Kenneth Lockhart Smith.
Right. So then, but then at the end, we see the last will and testament, which kind of like is a black cloud on his legacy because, like it or not, I mean, you can't take away the fact that he was a musical genius at developing great artistry in the music field. But his daughter, uh, from the first marriage, Alexis, got like 68,000 pounds, whereby I think 97% went to Judy Lockhart Smith. Of course, that favors Giles Martin and Lucy Martin, right? And then there was a lot of bitterness between them. And then, of course, Gregory Paul Martin, he was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and he had some terrible debts, and George bailed him out, and that's the last money you can see with me, you bloke. And he was cut off.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, what do you not do for your kids, right? You can almost see it how it played that way, though. He
sure.
would, yeah, he was doing everything he could to help his son, and families, they're complicated. You,
Yeah. No, but I
and
mean,
there's
you look and see what. So the second wife gets everything. The first wife, I don't know that necessarily. I'm sure she was being paid alimony by George at the
Oh
time. But
yes, she received a settlement and that sort of thing. There was no doubt about it.
right. So then, but I mean, yeah, what was his relationship like with Alexis? I mean, Alexis was. I mean, I don't think you could say that she was kind of spendthrift or kind of a scoundrel
No,
type
nothing
of
like
person.
that of the sort. I think that they got along just fine, and he kept in touch with all of his children throughout his life. This is what happens with created families. Sometimes it doesn't go well, right? So,
Yeah.
uh, I don't mean to be blasé about it, but this is just the way it is. And
Right.
I think George did his best to navigate it. The surviving spouse does get that larger piece of change in that situation. In fact, sometimes it's 100% to the surviving spouse. It's kind of great that he was looking out for her, his oldest daughter, in that way.
Right. As well as his chauffeur. I think they got the same amount of money. Anyway, so what's next on your on the horizon for Kenneth Womack's books. What are you working? Are you working on anything now, Kenneth?
I have part 2 of the Mal Evans story is coming out this fall. It will be Mal's memoirs that will be published in full, and then the next task will be to publish his diaries.
Oh, really?
Yes,
That's got to be interesting.
it is
That's
a towering project. Of course, a diary is exactly what it sounds like. It's several hundred days a year worth of notes for about 10 years. So,
It's so interesting. Is that published? Is it out there as a PDF that you can just go through? Or is it
I have
something
them
you
all,
actually-
but no, they're not published.
So in other words, you had some. I guess you got to know Mel Evans, right?
You really do, and you learn a lot about the Beatles.
When did he die? Didn't he die early?
He died on January 4th, 1976. It was essentially suicide by cop.
Oh wow, really?
He did not
Goodness
want to live
gracious.
another day. Yeah.
But was that in the U.S. or is it in the U.K. or where?
It was in Los Angeles, downtown.
Oh wow, it's terrible. Didn't know that.
It is, it's awful, but he had been unfaithful to his wife for years, and he was in a long spiral for having been found out for this reason. And
Well,
it's sad, but it's also a case of untreated mental illness, probably too.
right. So folks, listen, check out Ken Womack's books. His website again is www.kennethwomack.com. The book that we discussed mostly today was the book about volume 1 of the Sir George Martin biography, maximum volume, and Sound Pictures is the second part, I guess, right? Is that as long or is involved?
It's longer.
Oh my gosh! Do you see the Beatles in part 2? Also,
Oh
or no?
yeah, you go all the way to the
1966.
end of the career.
Wow, amazing! Such a fascinating time being able to interview you, Kenneth Womack. Check him out, and it's been great. And I hope I can interview you again. I mean, so many books that you published in such an interesting corpus of work about the Beatles. My gosh,
You just let me know when you want to hang out, and I'll be there.
great, Kenneth. Much obliged.
All right, have a great day, pal.
Love having you on, Kenneth Womack.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey folks, have you seen SpiritDaily.com and its amazing and mysterious news stories? SpiritDaily.com has testimonies about miracles, articles about strange occurrences both from the present and from the past, and the Christian angle to current events, news, science, spiritual, and even physical health. Also, read SpiritDaily.com and its accounts of the supernatural, the demonic, preternatural phenomena, and even exorcists expelling demons from time to time. But more importantly, you'll find uplifting writing about the Christian faith and family and power of prayer, the great power of the rosary, the saints, and more. Want great books like Cleansing Your Home from Evil or The Amazing Padre Pio? Again, go to SpiritDaily.com, and for exclusive content, subscribe to Spirit Daily Reports. Help Quorum Radio. Go to SpiritDaily.com. That's SpiritDaily.com.
There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. Nothing you can make that can't be made. No one you can save that can't be saved. Nothing you can do, but you can learn how to be you in time. It's easy. All you need is love. All you need is love. be. It's easy. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love. Love. Love is all you need. All you need is love. All together. All you need is love. Everyone. All you need is love. Love. Love is all you need. Love is all you need. Love is all